Hey there, Dave here. This video is to go with our reading of the paper White Ignorance by Charles Mills. And in this video, what I'm going to try to do is give you a little bit of background, a little bit of context, a little bit of information about some of what Mills is doing in this paper and some of what Mills is drawing on in his work in this paper. Hopefully this will be useful information for you as you read the paper and will be something that we can draw on in our discussion about the paper coming up. So I want to start by taking a step away from epistemology for a moment and thinking about a distinction that's more common in political philosophy, because it's something that Mills is drawing on in this paper. And this is the distinction that often goes by the name of the distinction between ideal theory and non-ideal theory. So you can think of these as two different ways to do political philosophy, but as you'll see, you could also think of this as two different ways to do a range of different kinds of philosophy. And I think one good way to read White Ignorance, the paper we're looking at this week, is to see it potentially as an application within epistemology of a certain approach to non-ideal theory. And Mills, in some of his other work, is well known as an advocate of non-ideal theory as against ideal theory within political philosophy. So I want to start there, look at the distinction there, and give you a sense of where Mills is coming from and some of Mills's other work that he's drawing on in making this sort of distinction. So, as far as I know, the language of the distinction between ideal theory on the one hand and non-ideal theory on the other comes from John Rawls. If it doesn't originate with Rawls, as it may well not, because I'm no historian of ideas here and certainly no historian of political philosophy, at the very least it's Rawls's work that has done a lot to make this distinction well known within philosophy and has done a lot to raise it to prominence. So, Rawls puts it this way. Rawls says, the intuitive idea is to split the theory of justice into two parts. Ideal theory assumes strict compliance and works out the principles that characterize a well-ordered society under favorable circumstances. Non-ideal theory, the second part, is worked out after an ideal conception of justice has been chosen. Only then do the parties ask which principles to adopt under less happy conditions. The principles of justice are chosen on the supposition that they will be generally complied with. Any failures are discounted as exceptions. So you can see here in the way that Rawls is thinking about this, ideal theory, as he has it, is something that tries to characterize. He's doing political philosophy, so he's trying to characterize society in a certain kind of way, and he talks about characterizing a well-ordered society under favorable circumstances. So ideal theory, as Rawls characterizes it, is a theory of what society would be like when everything's going well, when people are behaving as they should, when things are well-ordered and proceeding accordingly, when people are complying with what justice requires of them, at least generally. So he does acknowledge a room within ideal theory to think about cases where people are not behaving as justice requires, but he says, as we see, any failures, that is failures to comply with the principles of justice, any failures are discounted as exceptions. So ideal theory, as Rawls characterizes it, is a way to proceed to theorize where you think about, okay, how would things look like if they were working more or less? You know, maybe things go wrong now and again, but we're supposing things are broadly in place, that people are broadly doing what they ought to, and we try to think about how to characterize an ideal society under those circumstances. And Rawls says we should do that first when we're trying to think about how society operates. That's where we begin. Then we proceed to non-ideal theory. And non-ideal theory, Rawls says, is the second part is something to do after the ideal theory, and then you worry about what principles to adopt or how to organize society under what he calls less happy conditions. That is, under conditions of pervasive injustice, under conditions of oppression, things of that nature. So this distinction between ideal theory and non-ideal theory has proved influential, and Rawls's recommended method of proceeding to begin from ideal theory and only move to non-ideal theory after an ideal system has been described has been quite influential. Within political philosophy, there have been a number of critiques of starting from ideal theory. A large number of those critiques have come from the feminist tradition, and the feminist tradition is a tradition that Mills is drawing on considerably and explicitly in a range of his own work on this. Mills is well known for his own critiques of ideal theory, which often proceed by thinking about the role of race in political philosophy, but he's very explicit that he's drawing on a range of feminist literature in shaping the kinds of critiques that he makes. So, in an article called Ideal Theory as Ideology, this is a different article by Charles Mills. I'll put it up in the supplemental readings in case you're interested in taking a look at it. Mills runs through a number of things that he says characterizes this kind of Rawlsian ideals first approach to thinking about morality and to thinking about political philosophy. When we're thinking in this ideal way, Mills says we're doing things like idealizing the capacities that people have. We're doing things like supposing ourselves in a society with the absence of oppression, absence of domination, absence of coercion. These sorts of things are assumed off the table, again, because we're thinking about cases where people are largely behaving as they should, is the sort of picture. And so when we think about the kinds of societies that we're thinking about in doing ideal theory, they don't look much like the kinds of societies that we actually live in and occupy. And so Mill says the following about thinking in this way, about doing ideal theory. He says, how in God's name could anybody think that this is the appropriate way to do ethics? The ultimate point of ethics is to guide our actions and make ourselves better people and the world a better place. Ideal theory will not only be unhelpful, but will in certain respects be deeply antithetical to this goal. And the reason Mills thinks is that many of the difficulties that we face, many of the obstacles we face in guiding our actions and making ourselves better people and making the world a better place, many of the difficulties we face here are precisely difficulties that do have to do with the fact that we lack various idealized capacities, are difficulties that do have to do with the fact that people very often don't behave as they should, that it's not a strange exception when someone doesn't conform to justice, but is in fact a perfectly ordinary thing that many structures are built around. That oppression exists and structures many people's lives in many different ways. And if these are the sort of problems that we grapple with in structuring our society and trying to make our society better and trying to make ourselves better, then ideal theory, Mills thinks, will give us no traction on these problems, because ideal theory proceeds with a resolve to assume all these sorts of things off the table from the get-go. Mills goes on in that same piece, Ideal Theory as Ideology, to offer a potential explanation for the influence of ideal theory within philosophy, and he has in mind, in this piece, particularly moral and political philosophy, although, as we'll see, this critique will extend into epistemology as well. The explanation that Mills offers in that piece is this. He says, ideal theory is really an ideology, a distortional complex of ideas, values, norms, and beliefs that reflects the non-representative interests and experiences of a small minority of the national population, middle to upper class white males, who are hugely overrepresented in the professional philosophical population. So Mills's explanation for the prevalence of ideal theory within philosophy and within particularly moral and political philosophy, is what he has in mind as he's putting this forward, is the fact that demographically, if you look at who's writing the philosophy in these prestigious journals, who's employed in philosophy departments and so on, what you see demographically is not a representative cross-section of society by any stretch, but you see a strong overrepresentation of middle to upper class white males who have different interests, different experiences, that are shaped by their class position, by their racial position, by their gender position, so forth, and that these different interests and experiences, these non-representative interests and experiences, lead to focus on a non-representative selection of issues that is not representative of the interests and experiences of the population as a whole. And you can think about that kind of critique this way. If you think about pure reflection on moral or political ideals, unsullied by the world, imagining a society that's very different from the kinds of societies that we live in, or imagining the kinds of regulations or principles that would go well if followed. This sort of reflection can be a larger part of someone's life when they don't have to worry, for example, about doing the cooking, doing the cleaning, doing the childcare, when their bills are paid without any worries, things of that nature, right? Time to reflect on this kind of ideal society is unequally distributed. And so if, in particular, middle to upper class white men have more time to spend on that kind of reflection and do, in fact, spend more time on this imagining an ideal world rather than grappling with the sort of moral and political difficulties of their everyday lives simply because they face fewer moral and political difficulties in their everyday lives, then you would expect in those fields of inquiry where upper to middle class white men are overrepresented, such as philosophy, that you would see more inquiry into these kinds of idealized questions rather than into the moral and political questions that are perhaps more representative of the kinds of difficulties and struggles that people face day to day. So that's a critique that Mills has made of ideal theory or of the dominance of ideal theory in moral and political philosophy, a comparable tradition within epistemology that Mills also cites and is drawing on. So I want to take a look at the tradition that sometimes goes under the name naturalized epistemology. This is a tradition within epistemology that often presents itself as a turn away from what's sometimes called traditional epistemology and towards this idea of naturalized epistemology. There are a number of different ways of understanding what it is for epistemology to be naturalized or what it is to be a naturalized epistemology, just as there are a number of ways to understand what often goes under the heading of traditional epistemology. So this is going to be at best approximate. If you're interested in learning more about the tradition of naturalized epistemology, one place you might want to take a look is at the Stanford Encyclopedia article, which I'll put a link to in the supplemental readings on the Moodle in case you're interested in checking that out. So one thing you might wonder when you're thinking about epistemology, that is when you're thinking about what it is to know something, is are we meant to be thinking about an ideal knower, someone who potentially knows under ideal circumstances, someone who maybe achieves perfect certainty of at least some things, that is able to elevate those things to the status of unquestionable truths, who arrives at genuine perfect certainty? Or are we thinking about more situated knowers that exist in the world as it is, that struggle with various kinds of cognitive and other practical limitations, and maybe such that some of what they know falls short of perfect certainty, or maybe even such that nothing that they think can ever become perfectly certain? And this kind of contrast is reminiscent of the contrast between ideal and non-ideal theory in moral and political philosophy, where you can see the question as, are we thinking about people who genuinely achieve this ideal society, or are we thinking about us as we are struggling to make society better? Similarly, you can ask in epistemology, are we thinking about people who genuinely achieve this ideal of perfectly certain knowledge, or are we thinking more about us as we are struggling to know more? If the goal of epistemology, or if a goal of epistemology, is to understand and improve our knowledge, that is, knowledge for critters like us with the limitations that we have and the practical abilities that we have, then you might think that at least an important component of that epistemology would have to involve reflecting on those very limitations and how those limitations do and don't shape what we can know, and do and don't interfere with our access to truth or aid our access to truth, things of that nature. And this is some of what you see in the naturalized epistemology tradition, is that kind of reflection. So here's a quote from Quine that I think gives some of the flavor of this naturalized tradition in epistemology. Quine says, "For me, normative epistemology is the technology of truth-seeking. Like any technology, it makes free use of whatever scientific findings may suit its purpose. It draws upon mathematics in computing standard deviation and probable error and in scouting the gambler's fallacy. It draws upon experimental psychology in exposing perceptual illusions and upon cognitive psychology in scouting wishful thinking. It draws upon neurology and physics in a general way in discounting testimony from occult or parapsychological sources. There is no question here of ultimate value, as in morals. It is a matter of efficacy for an ulterior end, truth or prediction." So think just about that final remark that Quine makes there, right? He says there's no question here of ultimate value as in morals, and I take it what he means here is something like, we don't start out doing epistemology asking about knowledge by supposing or shutting out the idea of drawing on psychology, or by supposing or shutting out saying, well, physics will have nothing to tell us, for example, as we do epistemology, or mathematics will have nothing to tell us as we do epistemology. Rather, we start epistemology, as Quine is saying, with a goal in mind, and the goal, as he characterizes it at the end here, is truth or prediction. And you can see prediction as, attempting to predict is attempting to find out a truth, just a certain kind of truth, the truth about the future. So as Quine sees it, the goal of epistemology is to figure out how to get more truths. And so, for example, if we gain access to some truths via our perception, then it could be very useful for us to know about perceptual illusions to which we're subject, because those perceptual illusions can interfere with our ability to get truth via our perceptions, right? Some of what we see is true, a great deal of what we see is true, but some of what we see, say, if it's affected by an illusion, would not be true. And the more we understand these illusions, the better able we will be to seek truth through what we see. Or if you think about other senses other than vision, again, if they're subject to perceptual illusions as well, the better we understand those perceptual illusions, the better able we will be to seek truth via our perceptions. So Quine sees epistemology fundamentally as this matter of truth-seeking, and he says we should be drawing on whatever scientific information we can draw on in aid of that project of truth-seeking. Now, Quine in this passage, as he's talking about these various sources of information about our own ability to find truth, doesn't mention things like sociology or social psychology. He doesn't mention women's studies or critical race theory or gender studies. He doesn't mention history, linguistics, right? There are a whole range of fields that he doesn't mention. I take it as clear, though, that this range of issues, the sort of more social sciences and more humanities-oriented forms of inquiry, so long as they're truth-seeking, would very much fit with the spirit of what Quine is saying, even if Quine himself didn't have them first and foremost in mind. The end goal is truth or prediction, and the idea is to draw on whatever resources will help us achieve that end of truth or prediction. So you can see what Mills is doing in this paper, White Ignorance, as in part an attempt to carry out this kind of investigation, to see what sorts of insights we can gain within epistemology by drawing on knowledge gained, in particular in this case, from critical race theory and from sociology, and to some extent from history. So what Mill wants to articulate in this paper is the notion that he calls white ignorance. This is a phenomenon in which social structures, in particular racial social structures, can form an impediment to, by and large, white people's gaining certain knowledge. I say by and large white people, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in the video as we look at some detail. But he's looking in general at an obstacle to white people gaining certain kinds of knowledge, and this obstacle being formed in particular by racialized social structures. You might think about some of the discussions that we had over Fricker's book at this point, and in particular, the looking at testimonial injustice as an obstacle to gaining truth. Remembering testimonial injustice as an obstacle to truth is primarily, or at least first and foremost, an obstacle to gaining truth for the hearer, that is, for the person who is refusing to assign sufficient credibility, or who is failing to assign sufficient credibility to someone who's testifying, right? It prevents the hearer from gaining knowledge that they could otherwise have. So to the extent that these racial social structures will tend to lead white people to accord insufficient credibility to people of color, then you can imagine that resulting, if systematic enough, in a certain kind of white ignorance, right, in information that white people could be gaining via testimony from people of color. If they're failing to accord sufficient credibility to that testimony, then indeed they would be failing to get this knowledge. You'd have a potential instance of white ignorance. Mills doesn't want to restrict attention here just to the kinds of cases that Fricker would look at under testimonial injustice. He wants to think more generally about the ways in which racial social structures can be an obstacle for white people to gain knowledge in a range of different ways. He looks at a range of different ways in the paper, but that is one example we've looked at earlier this semester of a potentially intersecting phenomenon here, that phenomenon of testimonial injustice. If you are interested in taking a look at some of the ways that the work in the Fricker book interact with this notion of white ignorance, you'll see in the supplementary readings for this week, I've put up a paper there by Jose Medina that draws connections between Mills' work and Fricker's work, and then there are replies to that work both from Fricker and from Mills. So there's a bit of a discussion there that can help you see something of how these ideas come together. And Mills does a bunch in this paper to articulate this idea and to say a little bit more about what he has in mind. One important thing to note is that by white ignorance, Mills definitely doesn't have in mind just any old ignorance exhibited by white people. There's a great deal of things that lots of people don't know, that in particular white people don't know, that don't have anything to do in particular with their race. So Mills offers a few examples, like the exact temperature 20 miles down in the Earth's crust right now. I'm white. I have absolutely no idea what the temperature is 20 miles down in the Earth's crust below me right now, but my race is in no way a causal factor preventing me from knowing that thing or interfering with my knowledge of that thing, right? The ignorance that I have there, while it's definitely ignorance, is not in any way contributed to by my whiteness, and so as a result, that wouldn't count as white ignorance, even though it's an instance of ignorance exhibited by a white person. So that's one important clarificatory point that Mills wants to make. He's interested in the cases where it really is the racialized social structures that are playing a role, not just cases where someone happens to have a race and happens to be ignorant, but the case where the social structure really does feed into that ignorance, does contribute to that ignorance, or does form an obstacle to forming the true belief. Another point Mill raises is to say that this phenomenon of white ignorance is not going to be uniform across white people. He says it's best thought of as a tendency, and this is in line with what you should expect in general, right? Social sciences very rarely discover these sort of crisp law-like generalizations. The discoveries of social sciences or humanities are often much more flexible, much more involving in generalizations that have exceptions. There's a bunch of interesting work in philosophy of science on status of the special sciences and so on that's relevant here. But in general, you should expect the sorts of obstacles to knowledge that are come up with by this route not to be these sort of hard and fast, oh, no white person knows this and all white people know that. That sort of stuff is definitely out of view here. What Mills is talking about is much more tendencies in that kind of way. Mills wants to point out that this ignorance can be caused by these social structures in a range of different ways, and in particular these ways don't necessarily need to involve any particular individual racist motivation. So here's an example. You can imagine an educational system that in teaching 18th century history covers, for example, events like the American Revolution and the French Revolution, but does not cover the Haitian Revolution. All of these are 18th century revolutions, and the influence on the curriculum, it's not hard to imagine, could easily be structured by racial prejudice had by the curriculum deciders. Nonetheless, students in the classes that study these curricula, particularly if this is early enough education that students haven't had access to information through other sources, would come out of this class knowing about something anyway, about the American Revolution, about the French Revolution, but nothing at all about the Haitian Revolution. So that would be an instance of white ignorance in Mills's sense. Because what you have here are people, and now think about the students' ignorance in this case. What you have here are people who are ignorant of some facts, for example, even maybe that there was a Haitian Revolution at all, or how various facts about the Haitian Revolution, right? They're ignorant of these facts, and they're ignorant of these facts in a way that's been driven by the racialized social structures. We're supposing that this is a case where leaving the Haitian Revolution off of the curriculum is driven by the racialized social structures. In this case, I supposed it was explicitly driven by racial prejudice on the part of the curriculum designers. So you see how you can get these cases of white ignorance resulting that needn't involve any racial prejudice on the part of the people who are exhibiting the ignorance. So the students in this case, we don't need to suppose anything about whether they have any racist motivations at all. They're nonetheless ignorant as a result of the racialized structures that they play into. Or for another example, you can think about the Tasmanian genocide from the 19th century, where there were a number of instances of military commanders that were sending war parties out with the explicit mission of killing and exterminating Aboriginal Tasmanians, but were leaking false stories to the press during this time, announcing retirements of these extermination parties that they continued to support, that declared a number of the details of what they were doing military secrets and so on, right? So leaking false information to the press, declaring things military secrets, these are all things that can produce ignorance. If people trust what they read in the newspapers, or if they don't know what the contents of those military secrets are, then they don't know the truth about what's going on. And in this case, the truth appears to have been deliberately hidden in a range of ways. That results in this sort of ignorance. Obviously, the genocide in this case is strongly racially structured, and the desire to hide it is playing right into these structures, or is a causal result of these structures. So what you have in this case is another example of white ignorance, right? When you look at people who are ignorant of the nature of the genocide, whether of the specific details, of the fact that there was a genocide at all, what you see is that that ignorance is caused by these racialized structures. Note that in these cases, the ignorance resulting from this is not likely to be equally distributed. Victims of genocide know what's happening to them. Colonists in Hobart, even if they're very close by, may not if the information isn't there in the press. So these sorts of examples show that the ignorance in question, what Mills is calling white ignorance, is going to be certainly correlated with white people. It's going to be by and large white people who are exhibiting white ignorance. But Mills is careful to say that white ignorance is not only restricted to white people. You can imagine, for example, in our hypothetical school curriculum example, right, that example didn't assume anything about the racial makeup of the students in the classroom. And yet all of those students were within a system that was, at the very least, not giving them information about the existence of the Haitian Revolution or about basic facts about the Haitian Revolution. So that these students could easily remain ignorant in a way that's caused exactly by this phenomenon, so be a case of white ignorance, without themselves being white. That's something that Mills explicitly leaves open. So we shouldn't think of the phenomenon of white ignorance as being something that only arises within white people. Nonetheless, it won't be a coincidence that this ignorance is going to be more exhibited, tend to be more exhibited by white people. White people are going to be better able to lead their lives in ways that avoid gaining information about structures of racial domination. So you can see what Mills is doing in this chapter as an instantiation within epistemology of this sort of broader shift I articulated at the beginning between ideal and non-ideal theory. He wants to think not just about how we would come to know things under ideal circumstances, but how do the actual social structures that we live within, and he has in mind particularly racial social structures, shape our access to truth, and in the cases that he has in mind, interfere with, in particular, white people's access to truth in these sorts of cases. So that's what Mills is taking a look at. There's obviously a lot more to say about this, and hopefully we'll all get a chance to discuss it in the discussion coming up. So I will see you there, and in the meantime, I hope you're rocking. Catch you then.